three projects that I can share with you, or if we're low on time, I can share two of them or something like that. So, since moving back to Albuquerque, I grew up here. I moved back here in 2017. I've worked with this local collective called Friends of the Orphan Signs. And change slide. So, here in Albuquerque, running through kind of the downtown strip of the city, and actually cutting all the way through the city to the eastern mountains, we have a section of the historic Route 66, which, if you don't know, was one of the original highways in the US highway system, built in the 1920s, connecting Chicago and LA. So a big stretch of Route 66 runs through New Mexico and runs specifically through Albuquerque. And because of that, in the 20s through the 1950s, a lot of these signs were constructed all along that strip of the city that were like these tall, huge, distinctly shaped road signs, very colorful, neon lit, that were usually advertising something targeted at people passing through the city. So, hotels, motels, motor lodges, cafes, and restaurants. And yeah, you can go to that one, Maria, actually. Yeah, so hotels and motor lodges, all these kinds of things that people would need coming through the city. And it actually got so cluttered with these signs that in the 50s, I believe, the city passed an ordinance against constructing any more of these signs because it was making it difficult for new businesses to advertise themselves in visible ways. So the ordinance was that you couldn't build any more signs above a certain size, but you could grandfather in the old signs that were on your lot. So people could keep these historic street signs as the neighborhood and as the businesses changed. But what happens with that is that in between lot developments, a lot of the time these signs end up on abandoned and unused lots. So that is where we come in. Change slide. So Friends of the Orphan Signs was started by a sculptor who was my mentor in college named Ellen Babcock. And the idea is that we take these abandoned road signs, these signs that are located on abandoned lots, and we revitalize them and we fill them with public art. And we work with a lot of different kinds of signs, but we are particularly interested in these very historic road signs. A lot of our work is developed through a process of community engagement. So we work with youth artists in local high schools. We've worked with people in transitional housing in Albuquerque. We've worked with students at the university. We've worked with people at bus stops. The goal is that we're trying to get the community involved in and having some ownership over these artworks that are going to be in their communities. And we create both temporary and permanent public artworks, along with different kinds of educational programs so that people can get involved in the process of creating art. Change slide. So when I joined Orphan Signs, my goal was to, as a text-based artist like Gabriel, I was interested in what more we could do with public poetry and text on these signs. So I entered the collaborative as a core artist, mainly to do text-based projects. So this was the first project that I was lead artist on. It was the Donut Mart sign. This was an abandoned gas station and convenience store with a donut mart inside of it. And we usually have like some overarching themes that we're working with as a collective. And this year we were thinking a lot about sustainability and how you could create an art piece with what was already there. So our goal for this sign was to create public poems using only the letters that were on the sign when it was abandoned. So this to the right was sort of the key we used. because both sides of the sign read any size fountain, 99 cents ATM EBT inside. So all of our poems were made by unscrambling those letters. And change slide. So with this particular sign, I was thinking a lot about the idea of abandonment and what happens when spaces in our community go unused, spaces that we are accustomed to, and the process by which they become abandoned. I was thinking about how that relates to our personal lives. So a lot of the poems that I tried to create had to do either with change and starting something new, or with, like the last slide, finding some sort of connection moving forward. And change slide. So that was the first project. This is the second project I wanted to share with you all, which was my project last year. It's called Keywords. So I like this photo. This is from a documentary, actually, that a local filmmaker made this year about people living in a part of Albuquerque called the International District. And the sign that we're working with there on the side of the road was a historic nightclub in Albuquerque that was a huge part of particularly the Spanish language music scene here from the 60s to the 80s. So people would go to the Caravan nightclub for norteño music and ranchera music and all these different kinds of music that are really important in Albuquerque. And that nightclub went under in the early 2000s. The city bought it and they're building a new public library. This was an area of town that has been overlooked for a long time in terms of the city investing its resources, in large part because it's a large immigrant population. A lot of people of color live in this area. And so for a long time, it was just kind of a segregated part of the city that the city did not invest a lot of resources in. So this area actually has not had a public library ever. So this new public library is kind of a big deal. And we wanted to create this project to welcome the new library. And change slide. So I put together a series of workshops in public libraries that sort of triangulated this area. So people who didn't have access to a public library in their community, if they went to a library, they'd be going to kind of these closest by locations. And these were drop-in workshops that were open to the public. We would just invite whoever was in the library at the time in to be part of the workshop. And I gave people writing prompts that came from the library's collection or that had some cultural resonance with this area. We read some Vietnamese writers, we read a lot of Latinx writers, and from there I designed prompts for people to write their own poetry. So these were the first two signs that went up. This was right at the beginning of COVID. So our library workshops actually got cut off. And we had to pivot like everyone's doing and transition into some sort of online programming. So that's on the next slide. So we started in April for the Keywords project, giving people daily writing prompts that they could engage in, send us their writing, and then we would install it in sort of bi-weekly rotations on the sign. And for these writing prompts, it was during the first kind of full month of quarantine. And I was very interested in the way our spheres were kind of shrinking, right? And Albuquerque is a very different layout of city than Boston. Everything's extremely spread out. Areas are usually zoned either for residential or business, so you don't have as many businesses in communities. So people were very much suddenly limited to literally just their neighborhoods. So I tried to create prompts that would allow people to observe something new and find something surprising within their own neighborhoods and within their own homes. And change slide. So that ended up being how we got the rest of our poems. We're still putting them up, and we'll basically put them up until they tell us we have to stop. But during the pandemic and during quarantine, it was interesting to see just how the quality of people's writing changed. And a lot of the submissions we received spoke very directly to what people were going through during the pandemic. So those were 2 reader board projects. Gabriel, how am I doing on time? Would you like me to talk about this last project?
No, we're doing great on time. We have plenty of time.
All right, awesome. So I'll talk about this next project, which is the last one that I was involved in. We got access as a collective to a historic archive of photographs at the Albuquerque Museum. And I was lead artist on this project, and I partnered with another local Latina poet named Becca Alderete Baca. And we're both Latina poets and artists, but we have a very different history within New Mexico. Her family has been here for generations and generations, whereas my family ended up here really by accident. My dad immigrated from Cuba. My mother is first generation Peruvian American. So we sort of ended up in New Mexico by chance when I was little. So we had these different kind of perspectives that we were trying to bring together. And we were interested when we looked at just hours and hours of these photographs. There were 2 kinds of photographs that particularly drew our attention. First, we were very interested in historic photographs of women of color in Albuquerque. We were interested in the patterns that we saw and how many fewer photographs there were of women, particularly women alone, than there were of men. How women were mostly photographed in wedding portraits, family portraits, and maternity portraits. And I don't have one here, but we were also interested in how Indigenous women were often photographed through a very clearly tourist-oriented lens. So we were interested in these photographs that both kind of adhered to and broke that pattern, and what that could potentially say about how women have been historically seen in our city and community. And then change slide. We were also interested in kind of the first aerial shots that were taken over Albuquerque, and different historical aerial shots that have been taken of the city over time, particularly because our city's ecosystem very much centers on the Rio Grande River. And the Rio Grande has changed a lot over time. This image was taken maybe like on the left was taken maybe like 30 years ago. And the river is much, much smaller today, and it looks very different. And that has to do with the way the city has grown and water usage has grown, but it also has a lot to do with climate change and how climate change has affected New Mexico. And so we were envisioning this on the right is sort of the network of arroyos and acequias in Albuquerque. We're interested in how in 30 years, if you took this photo again, it might again look very different. So change slide. So these were some of the compositions that we made, sort of reframing and restructuring the images that we were working with. Becca wrote the fragments of poetry that went on here that came out of our conversations. And Gabrielle and I have talked a lot about the visibility of text in public space, how you generally want big readable text that people can take in from the road. And we thought about that in this project a lot because this is a part of the city. There are bus stops right under these signs, and there are two schools on the lots where these signs are. So a lot of people actually stand and walk around these signs, as well as the people who drive past on the road. So we actually created purposely a slightly more intimate text here so that people would kind of see an interesting photograph from the road and have a different experience if they were waiting at the bus stop underneath the sign. So those are the three projects that I have that I've been involved in most recently. And I'm really interested just to talk to you all about this question of text in public space and how you all have been thinking about it. And if you all have any questions.
Do you have any more I don't know how like experiences like could you share more about your experiences with like working with the youth
Yeah, for sure. Do you mean within this particular project or within my larger practice?
within your larger practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So Urbano gave me some of my first opportunities to develop art collaboratively with young people like yourselves. And it became a really influential part of my process. I've actually done a lot more projects now where youth artists are involved in the process of creating and designing the artwork. Um, a lot of my projects at Urbano were kind of exploratory. We were exploring an idea together and then creating an installation either out in the community or in the Urbano space. I like working with youth artists because you all are open to experimenting and trying different things and shaping the project from there. So when I work with youth artists or when I work in any kind of community engaged process, I like for us to be equal collaborators and kind of have equal ownership over the process and the work. So outside of Urbano, I've worked here with a teaching arts space called Working Classroom that's very similar to Urbano and the way you all structure your programming. And the most recent project we did that is still ongoing actually was we created a design for a public sculpture that's going to go in a community space. And the sculpture is based on the stories of local bilingual early childhood educators. So it's a sculpture that spells out a phrase. It's also a text sculpture. And each of the letters is made of cast gypsum toys and kind of daycare materials that we built up into these letters. And that project is on my website. So the way youth artists were involved in that project is that they did the community engagement aspect with me. We were interviewing educators in our community. We were taking down transcripts of their oral histories. We were doing our own writing in response. And then they also learned the process of gypsum casting and helped me build the sculpture prototype. And now they're helping me build the rest. So that's sort of indicative of the process I usually work with youth artists. We are involved together in community engagement and then in kind of production. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Cece.
My name is Lania, and I have a question like going off of that. I was just wondering because you said like when you work with teens and like kids in the group, like you explore your options and stuff like that. Is that the same when you're like working on your own? Because I know like when I'm working in a group versus when I'm working on my own, my plan, like my mindset is different. So I was just wondering like what's your like plan, I guess.
It's weird because I thought for a long time it was very different. I thought that the way I developed a project on my own versus how I developed it with other people was very different. And maybe it used to be, but over time, they've just sort of, the processes have influenced each other, I guess. And now I feel that even when I'm creating a design for a sculpture on my own or a drawing on my own, I kind of have an exploratory phase. So, writing and journaling is a big part of my practice. Any youth artists who have worked with me in developing a project know that we write every day. And that's sort of the way we think through and sort through our ideas and come to, how do I intersect with this issue or this theme, or what's my experience with this community? Because I think that that's important to, when we're making art, particularly towards social change and social justice, to constantly be thinking about our own position, right? So that happens a lot in a group setting. We do a lot of writing, a lot of discussing, a lot of visual experiments, and the final product sort of comes out of all of that. Because as people write, as people create cool things visually, we sort of see what we respond to as a group, and that's how we create an installation. And more, that's just become what I do on my own too. I do a lot of writing, I do a lot of sketching, I do a lot of thinking and talking to people. And I find that to be much better than when I go into a project thinking I know exactly what I want it to look like, right? I like now having more flexibility for something to change.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Lania. That's how you pronounce your name?
Yeah.
You said it was different for you, though. I'd be curious to hear a little bit about how you find it to be different.
Well, for me, it's different because, like, when I work by myself, I like to think that, like, I'm very independent. So, like, the teacher gives me, like, an assignment, or if I'm, like, in a group and we have, like, a topic or something we have to cover, I think that when I'm by myself, I kind of jump right into it. And I'm kind of like, I have to get this done, and I know what I'm doing. But then when I'm, like, in a group with other kids, I kind of fall back and I let other people lead. So I feel like that's something that I struggle with, because on my own, I'm such, like, I don't know, I'm such a strong character on my own. Like, I have this independence in me. I'm just like, I can do this. Like, but when I'm in a group, it just, I don't know, my mindset, it changes a lot. And that's why I was just wondering, like, for you, because I know you do, like, you work with, like, people your age and then people, like, my age. So I was just wondering.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, because I always felt sort of similar, especially in academic stuff, right? That I felt so confident and independent and like I could take charge of a project on my own. And in a group, I'm personally very shy and introverted, so I would usually like recede into my turtle shell. Um, and often wouldn't feel as good about the final product because I wasn't as involved as I would have liked to be. So yeah, it is a challenge over time. For me, it was more forcing myself to be involved, to speak up, um, to see myself as collaborating with other people's ideas, and to be receptive to their ideas, sort of the yes and mentality that we have in improv theater, where you take someone's idea and then you build off of it. I sort of developed those things in myself to get better at working in groups.
My name is Diane, and I have a question. So, I don't know if you can hear me right,
Yeah, I
but
can.
I was reading the description of the orphan friends of the Orphan Signs, and it said that you adopted the street signs, and you probably said this in the introduction, but like, how was it? Like, how was the process of adopting them, or is it like easy, or is it like hard?
That's a super interesting question, and I think it says a lot about just how public artists have to think in general, especially when you're working with a particular site. Uh, the ownership of these signs, like who actually owns them, can be very complicated sometimes. So some signs that we locate, we know that we can just call the city, and the city owns the sign and owns the lot if they're developing it, and we can usually get access to the sign really quickly. But there are other signs that are owned by private owners. Sometimes they don't want you to develop the sign, or they want to be really involved, or they want it to be an advertisement. Even if the kind of community wants something different, individual retail developers have different interests sometimes. So we have some signs that came together super easily, and some that were like a long process of getting access to the sign. And sometimes that affects like the temporality of our projects, because we have some that are very temporary, and then we have some that are permanent installations. So that relates sometimes. That's kind of how long we adopt the sign for, right? Some of them are very ephemeral and we only have access to them. Like Donut Mart, we had for 8 months, I think, or maybe almost a year. And other signs were given access for a much longer time. So the process of adopting the sign usually involves figuring out who owns it, getting in talks with them, seeing if we can get access to the sign and for how long. And we have some signs that we have permission to work with regularly year to year. So the signs where revision, the photography project where it is right now, those are actually signs that we have access to every year. And they're in front of or between two schools called Highland High School and the Media Arts Collaborative Charter School. And those are two schools that we collaborate with them every year and the students develop artworks for the signs. So revision will rotate out, and the work by the students will go up later in the year. So yeah, it's different. It's different for every sign, how we kind of go about the process of adopting them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diane.
Okay, so building off like the ideas of signs, how do you go about like picking the right image, I guess? I don't know if that makes sense, but like when you're coming up with a sign, we see signs like every day all the time. So how do you like make yours different or like the message stand out?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's such an interesting question, because it's something that we're constantly thinking about. We sort of have our baseline as a collective of things that read well and don't read well on signs, just in terms of like the aesthetic composition that people are looking at. So we've noticed that very complicated compositions, like a collage with a lot of different small objects, tends to be too cluttered for people to make any sense of what they're looking at when they're driving past a sign or riding past on the bus or something. So we've noticed that simpler compositions tend to read better. We've noticed that high contrast, like black and white or bright color, tends to work well, as opposed to kind of like muted and neutral and subtle palettes. So we have those kind of compositional things in the back of our minds. And when we collaborate with people, we go over some of those things. Beyond that, like I said, we sort of have some overarching themes that we will bring to our collaborations. One year was sustainability, another year was justice, and we'll make artwork towards those themes. And then some individual projects like revision will come together with sort of, we kind of know what we want to do. We know we're working with photographs. We know we're working with this idea of sort of interrogating our history, and that will guide the production of the final artwork. We like bringing in a lot of guest artists and teaching artists and collaborating artists who work in different mediums so that we're not just bound to like only digital imagery or things like that. We had, for one of the collaborations with students, we had a ceramicist, and the students were actually working, creating images out of clay that then got photographed. They got like glazed, photographed, and put on the sign. So there's a way for a lot of different materials to actually become part of the sign composition. But we definitely always try to have in the back of our mind what works, what doesn't work. And like with revision, when we were thinking about those people waiting under the sign and walking up to it, we are very conscious of, for a particular site, how do people tend to interact with it? Are they looking at it off the freeway? Are they walking past it? Are they gathering under it? Is this near a bunch of corporate businesses or next to, neighborhoods and schools? Because sometimes those historical aesthetics will come into play. And one example would be a project we did called Casa Varelas, which was working at a community site in Albuquerque's sort of oldest historic Spanish-speaking community. And we worked a lot with local artisans to sort of create, it was like a reader board with an image above it. So the image involved some old kind of like Santos iconography, and then the message came from people in the community too. So we try to respond to the context that's around the sign and involve people in its composition. You guys ask really good questions.
Sara, I had a question. You had mentioned a little while ago about these kind of statues that were being built as kind of a way to honor these early childhood bilingual educators in Albuquerque. Can you kind of talk about the role of English and Spanish in your work, and the context in which one may be used instead of the other or in combination with the other? And then also just that might be an interesting opportunity, I think, to talk about just bilingualism in general. I mean, I don't know how many people in the group have been to New Mexico, but just thinking about New Mexico's history with bilingualism versus Boston's, I don't know, I feel like that was all kind of a loaded question, so just interpret that however you wish.
Yeah, I like to tell people who hear me speak Spanish that I have a very confused Spanish because I grew up, I always grew up very conscious of language and of what language was doing around me, because I had, on one side of the family, all Cuban Spanish, on one side of the family, all Peruvian Spanish. They were very different. We kind of floated in between English and Spanish in my house. And when I was very little, we came to New Mexico, in part because of the Latinx and kind of self-identified Hispanic population here, because my dad worked at our university. And my mother has always been a translator and interpreter. So I was also always cognizant of the ways she was moving between language professionally. So translation was always just a constant part of like my existence and my identity. But it was interesting too, because New Mexico is the only state in the US that had its own Spanish, and that Spanish was the official language of the state for a really long time in its history, up until I think the 1960s. And Gabriel, I know you worked with a historian at SFAI, so you might even know a little bit more about that. But New Mexico's a tri-cultural area, right? So the Spanish colonized New Mexico before the New Mexico was even integrated into the Union. So when we were still part of Mexico. And so for a long time, there was kind of a combination, and our local culture is very much built off of a combination of Spanish colonial culture, immigration from Central America, especially Mexico, and our very large indigenous population. So we have our own Spanish. We had a very unique history around Spanish, but there was also a huge effort in the 1970s to shut down New Mexican Spanish and shift the state towards English. So a lot of my friends who come from New Mexican families, Spanish disappeared. Their grandparents might have been only Spanish speaking, and then it disappeared in their parents' generation because it was penalized in the school system and in social spaces and things like that. So there was sort of a large scale disappearance of New Mexican Spanish. And so it's like you feel Spanish everywhere. It's in the street names, it's in like kind of the fabric of the community, but it actually isn't spoken in a lot of the city unless you are in very specific pockets of our immigrant communities. So it's a very strange linguistic history in New Mexico that I was always sort of cognizant of. And so when I'm making artwork here, I'm sort of interested in moving in between Spanish and English. I'm interested in the fact that even people who don't speak Spanish will understand a lot of it and have like an emotional response and connection to the language. So that's why I'm invested in kind of bringing it to public space. We're playing with some ideas right now around specifically New Mexican Spanish, which has its own little linguistic inventions and things that people recognize, and seeing how we could put that up in public space. And yeah, so for me, it's a constant question. And Gabriel and I have talked about how so many people live in between languages, in between Spanish and English. And we found with that particular project with the early childhood educators, these were educators who taught equally in Spanish and English, but when they were telling us their stories, they wanted to speak in Spanish, and that was where they were more comfortable. The majority of them were Mexican American in this particular collective of early childhood educators we were working with. So we ended up, the phrase that we're spelling out in the sculpture is in Spanish. And a chapbook that we created from the project is in Spanish and English. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but constant question.
I have a
Yeah. Go ahead.
so my name is Mario, and so my question is, how long does it take to adopt the sign? And if it takes too long, would you just quit or?
Sometimes we have to quit. There's one sign that we've wanted so long because it's sort of shaped like a butterfly. And it's been abandoned on this corner of this old like car washing lot for years, for like 10 years. And it's just sort of falling apart and rotting. And we were like, we can we can fix that. We can, like repair it. We can make art in it. And the owner of the sign is just a jerk. He does not want to be involved in anything artistic. And it's a flat no from him every time we're like, hey, we have another idea. So there are a few developers and private owners who don't want to work with us. There are a few who really want to keep their signs empty, even if it's not necessarily what the community around them wants. There's one sign that's shaped like a fork with a crown in the middle, which is an amazing street sign. And the community around it has approached us about doing something in that sign. And the owner is like, no, I feel like you erase the history of the sign if you put something new in it. So people have really strange like perspectives around, and not even strange, like it's understandable, but around the idea of preservation and history. And some people just don't want artwork in the signs that they own. So those two signs are kind of like our white whales. We've been trying to work for them with them for years. And then there are other signs that come together really quickly. Sometimes people who own signs will come to us and say, we would love for you to do something with our sign. And then that's great because we don't even have to pursue adopting the sign. So that happened with like our university has been expanding and buying some of the land around its grounds. And that involved like two giant billboard size signs that were on an old car sales lot. And so they came to us for a project we have called Plain Sight. And they were like, hey, you can work with this if you want. So it depends a lot on the sign. It depends on kind of the chain of ownership. That's entirely, dictates how long it takes for us to get involved.
And on that note, when people don't want you involved, because and now, I mean, this is something that we'll talk about as a group as we move forward. That, I mean, there's so many different ways to put some kind of sign in the public space, and one way is just to kind of do it, and then another way is collaborating with the community around you and collaborating with specific businesses like you have done with the Orphan Signs project. And so when you're approaching someone, particularly if it's for the first time, is there a certain kind of attitude, technique, approach that you have found becomes successful? Because you kind of think to yourself, okay, well, this is such a beautiful project. Like, who would not want to be involved with this? Mm-hmm. So anyway, I mean, what have you found works when you want to kind of develop a relationship with a particular local business or person?
Well, I find at the beginning, a lot of the times we'll be talking to people like developers, right, who have often not that much experience with art or not that much of an experience with public art. And so when it comes to like business owners, like developers, they can be very hesitant just because they're like, I didn't know public art could be on a street sign, even if our street signs have been up all over that avenue. There are people who are hesitant because they're not sure, or they're like, well, what's it going to look like? And we might be proposing a project where we're experimenting a lot and collaborating a lot, and we can't tell them exactly what it's going to look like, right? We can give them samples of our other work, but sometimes we have to say, you would just have to kind of trust us if you like the rest of our work. So we've noticed that it's very important to talk to people about these signs as an important historic aspect of the community, because a lot of times people are looking at them only for their business potential, and not necessarily thinking about, oh, this sign has a history and it has ownership within this community, and it could be, something great to kind of give back to the community around me. So we talk a lot about that. We share a lot of the work we've done and the process by which we create it. And there are a couple people who will reach out to again every few years, but if we get a no, we get a no, and we'll kind of back off and respect someone's wishes for their site. So our approach is generally very celebratory of the site. We also have been doing a lot of thinking around our public artwork in relationship to development, right? Like, we have signs that have drawn attention to abandoned lots that people didn't even notice or think about. And there has been more interest then in developing those lots or in people pitching their businesses because of that attention. So that's something that we can share with developers. And we can share that this is an opportunity where we often get funding to repair aspects of the sign that have broken down. So if people in the future want to use the sign for any specific reason, we're like, you're getting free repairs, like we'll fund the reparation of the neon system or the LED system, or we'll repair the backing so that we can install vinyl on it. So we do think that there's a lot of just practical good that the art process can bring to these sites. And sometimes people need the practical side of it because they don't quite connect with the creative side of it.
What's next for you?
So right now, I am working on securing funding for the rest of our gypsum sculpture for the early childhood educators. That's going to be a permanent installation in a building that's being constructed right now. So we sort of did the first phase of production, and now we're getting funding for the second phase of production. Orphan Signs, I mentioned that we have some ideas around New Mexican Spanish that we're working on securing a new reader board for. And the Keywords project, something interesting that came out of the Keywords project on the nightclub sign was that people have a lot of memories of this nightclub, right? They remember being there, they remember their parents dancing there. So we're actually hoping to hold a workshop specifically for people to tell their stories of the nightclub and then put some of that text up on the marquee. So those are sort of the next stages of some of those projects. I have a few new projects. We have an annual exhibition here every year called Temporary Installations Made for the Environment, TIME, and it travels around to different sites in New Mexico. So I'm collaborating on an installation for this year's TIME exhibition. It's going to be like a sculptural installation at their site for this year. And it's a site that is very important to our Indigenous community. So for that project, I'm actually collaborating with youth artists at some of our Indigenous schools to create text that's going to be on this installation. So those are some things I'm working on. What's next for you guys in this project?
Well, actually, that's something that we're going to talk about later this afternoon.